Hey writers and readers, I'm Adrian Buskey, and you're listening to Season 4 of Fictitious, a podcast about the storytelling craft of science fiction and fantasy. It's my pleasure to welcome J. Michael Straczynski to the show. Joe is well known in science fiction fandom for creating and writing the seminal TV series Babylon 5, and recently Sense8 with the Wachowskis for Netflix. His body of work includes the films Changeling and Marvel's Thor, acclaimed comic book runs on The Amazing Spider-Man, Rising Stars, and Midnight Nation, and influential runs on 80s animation properties He-Man, She-Ra, and the Real Ghostbusters. His latest work is a memoir called Becoming Superman. It's a brave exploration of a torrid family history and the incredible odds he fought to shape himself into a successful writer. The book is by turns moving, entertaining, and alarming, with a truth is more terrifying than fiction quality that will shake readers to their core. For writers, it's a prime example of how the craft is more than a hobby or career pursuit. It is an opportunity to conquer reality and make of it what you desire. Becoming Superman arrives on July 23rd from Harper Voyager, and Joe, welcome to Fictitious.
Thank you. Happy to be here.
You're one of those guys that when I dig into the past career, it's that reminder of like how many properties you've touched that had a big impact on me as a kid, as a teenager, as an adult. Even as I was sitting down to write this intro and I was going through your IMDb and going through like the back catalog, things like Captain Power stood out to me, and the fact that you did Midnight Nation and Rising Stars, which were a couple of the comic books that brought me back into the fold of comics when I was in college after I'd been away from them for a long time. They were the ones that grabbed me off the shelf and made me go, oh, you know what? Maybe I'll jump back into this medium again. And that goes without saying about like, you know, the really high profile, sci-fi TV and stuff that you've done. But this new thing that you've got coming out, I mean, this is a very different kind of work in the sense that it's a memoir and it's a life story. And I don't know that the average person who's aware of your work is ready for what they're going to get hit with this book. So can you tell me more about Becoming Superman, like what this memoir is all about?
Yeah, growing up, we lived in a very difficult, abusive, violent family that was built on secrets about keeping things from the outside world and from each other. And I had just learned over the years that what happens in the house stays in the house. There's a thing, even after you're not a kid anymore, part of your brain still holds on to that fear. And consequently, even though I was doing all the shows you talked about and the books you talked about, nobody really knew where I came from, what that past was. I never really talked about it. And I realized that I needed to stop running away from that there are a lot of people out there who come from similar circumstances, and people out there who think that because they didn't go to the best schools or have the best resources or have a supportive family, that their dreams are more remote from possibly ever happening. So I said, let's take all my stuff, get it out of my system, put it into a book, and at the same time try and find a way to encourage people who are in similar straits with also dreams of becoming writers or artists or directors or actors or what have you, give them some measure of hope, because God knows if I can do it, anybody can do it.
Well, I think that this kind of work definitely requires an extensive amount of soul searching. And really, I mean, just some of the things that you went through are so far beyond the pale of, I have kind of a messed up background. My wife has kind of a messed up background. And I was telling her about all the stuff I was reading in the book. And I was like, it has that effect of making us feel like, oh, wow, our stuff was pretty simple. I mean, and I don't say that to diminish anything on either end. It's just that you went through extraordinarily difficult circumstances. Some of them they would require trigger warnings in order to talk about, like on this podcast, you know. What made you decide this was the time to bring all that to the light, to explore that, you know, at this stage in your career, at this stage in your life, to say, I want to take the narrative abilities that I have as a writer and apply them to my own story?
Well, I think that one hits a certain age where you realize there may not be wisdom in waiting too long. And also there are a few people in my life who are still able to corroborate some of this stuff. Because you're right, some of it is so off the chart, weird, dangerous, bizarre. I needed people who I could go to and say, this is my recollection of it. Is this yours as well? And some of those are still around, but might not be here in 2 or 3 years, because it's not enough to just have my word for it. So I might, with my sister, to my uncle Frank in New Jersey, who is still with us, and others to sort of say, let's get this done now while we're all still here to tell that story.
in science fiction and fantasy, we live with the suspension of disbelief, that ability to go into a fanciful story or go into something with some wild and crazy twists and allow the story to take us there because we're there for the ride. With something like this, the series of events that brought your family to this country, the way that the family was built internally and externally, the way they faced the world, the stuff that you had to go through, any single bit of those things. I mean, essentially the first chapter of the book is already so wild that it sounds like, it could be Game of Thrones-ish kinds of background stories, but in, present day. And then, and it only goes from there. So how do you build a narrative about your own life? Like you said, I mean, you've got corroborating sources, but how do you build that story in a way where you can both entertain an audience and keep them attached, but then not strain that credulousness too far, whilst like delivering it? Like how did you handle that within the narrative of the story?
I think a large part of it was that I kept a reporter's distance emotionally from the story. It would be very, very easy to really get overwrought about the things that happened. And the more one dives into the notion of being really emotional about it, oh my God, this is a terrible thing that happened to me, that you begin to make it feel false. So I thought, let me just keep, I used to be a reporter, let's build in that distance. And where I possibly can, leaven it with a measure of humor. And where I could find outside sources. So, for instance, when I got jumped by a street gang in San Diego and almost beaten to death, I made sure to reference, the newspaper article that came out the next day, where there was photographic evidence. I have some of that as well. But the hard part in structuring it was deciding, do I want to do it in a chronological fashion, or do I want to do it sort of Slaughterhouse-Five fashion, where you're diving in and out of the narrative? Initially, I actually started it with that back and forth structure. But then as I got into it, I need to go chronological because you need to build one thing on top of the other. Beyond that question of accumulating documents, my father passed away a couple of years ago. And in his possession, I found a lot of documents, a lot of letters and correspondence that also helped me to get more information. Because a large part was me discovering the story myself, because in my family, these things were all kept secret. And I had to sort of, once I decided to do this story, start backtracking through all these different people to say what really happened, what were you doing, what did you see, how does that compare with what I saw? And in a way, the detective story of that goes to the course of the entire book in terms of what my father did when he was in Eastern Europe. That becomes a detective story that gives the story an overarching hook that lets you stay with it and bring the reader along.
There was something that I noticed in the narrative style where even within the individual chapters, there's frequent little like act breaks in the chapters. And I thought they were interesting because they allowed you to kind of piece out some of this information or some of these scenes, but give like a tension relief, give a break point where you're like, some of this stuff is hard to stomach. It's hard to handle in a cumulative fashion. So you've got these kind of moments where you let it break, maybe drop it on a line that sets up what comes next. It struck me as I was reading it that I was like, oh yeah, this is a TV writer. This is somebody who knows how to balance those moments to, switch at the right time to give us that tension relief. I felt like that came through in it. You mentioned that your background in journalism affected your writing on this, but how else did, a long history in film and television and comics and stuff affect how you would think about and write your own life?
In a lot of ways, I tried to keep that background out of it, because when you write for television, you write for film, you write for comics, you're used to writing toward the punchline. You're used to writing toward the big conflagration. But I need to go small. I need to keep this at a very, not flat affect, but a straightforward tone. And that, I think, makes the moments more poignant rather than less. And you're right. I went through and broke it up to give the reader some measure of relief from what was going on. In TV and film, you're looking for the car chase, whereas this book is more about the quieter moments. Like, for instance, the one story that people are reacting to, oddly enough, one of the strongest, is the decoy cat. So my mother was institutionalized several times, and when she got released, I was brought to visit her, and she didn't really even know who I was, but she would react to a cat when I would hold it up to her. And I would bring that cat, the decoy cat, every time I saw her, and she would pet the cat. And once, her hand touched mine with affection, and it's the only time that she ever touched me with affection. And so I always make sure to hold that cat and turn it around so that she always touched my hand. I actually found a copy of a photograph of me and the decoy cat that lets you be in the book. But, that's more the just strict repertorial approach to telling that story versus let's bring in the whole film, television, animation, comic book background, which would, I think, make it ring false. You can't. It's hard to use the tools of fiction in a nonfiction environment.
Something else that this book covers a lot, the title of it, Becoming Superman, addresses how your exposure to the character of Superman, to his ability to stand up to people, his moral center, but also that ability to change from an average person to something extraordinary, was something you held on to in your youth and allowed you to kind of power through with some really difficult things. I think that, there's a parallel in there too that's about your work ethic. You came with a father who had no work ethic and constantly caused problems because of that, and in turn have become somebody that, like, I think in a lot of ways has kind of got a legendary work ethic. Been aware of your work for years. When I would read about writing, I would read about how J. Michael Straczynski writes 7 days a week and takes off 2 days a year and this many hours a day and whatever. Like, so with that work ethic, how did the events that you chronicle in Becoming Superman shape that? How did you become this person that you are as a writer and creator through that?
I think it's a number of different factors. Number one of which is that writing became for me an escape. I remember when I was writing a humor column, still living at home with my family, my father rampaging drunk and through the house, and I'm crying at the typewriter writing a humor column. But it let me escape from that environment. I also have found for the very first time something that I genuinely loved. Everything that I ever had as a kid that mattered to me or counted was thrown away at various points. But in writing, I had something that they couldn't throw away, something that I would always have with me. And it was the one thing that I owned, one thing that I truly loved. And the more time I spent with it, the more I enjoyed it. And I always knew that I was going to be a writer. That was my dream from day one. And like, if you want to be a professional athlete, you have to work at it every single day. My friend Harlan Ellison once pointed out that, you say to a plumber, my God, you fixed 5,000 toilets. That's amazing. How do you do that? It's just your job. It's what you do. And for me, this is what I was born to do. It's not just what I do, it's what I am. I am the most whole when I am behind the keyboard and writing. When I am away from that, I'm aware of the fact that there are pieces missing in me, and that I'm more of a Lego set in human form than an actual person. It's the only moment when I can take the keyboard and slice it onto my heart that I feel like I'm a human being.
I think that's a really important part of what you address here. A lot of times people talk about writers in general terms. They often talk about writers as being sort of classically introverted. And I mean, there's a lot of very extroverted writers, or maybe ambiverted, like where they, that back and forth between being with people, but then being at the keyboard alone with their thoughts is a thing. But I think you addressing that this is where your real persona lives, where you feel like all of yourself versus maybe not having that otherwise. I mean, I think that's a powerful part of the story, and addressing how the background that you had maybe didn't allow for you to develop a lot of those things because you had to defend what parts of yourself you could against the onslaught of every day. So, I mean, I think that's something that people should really pay attention into here is what the craft does for people. But these days, what is that writing like? What is the schedule that you keep? Again, and after all of these years, how do you sustain that rigorous writing schedule?
The funny part is that for me, sustaining the writing schedule isn't hard. It's trying to peel out the moments of not writing. It's the hard part. I used to say I worked every day except for New Year's Day, Christmas Day, and my birthday. But the last several years, those have also gone by the boards. My last actual vacation where I had more than 2 days of not writing was somewhere in the mid-90s. So you would think after a while it would slow down. But for the last X number of years, every year is busier than the year before. This year, obviously, the bio is coming out, which took a while to write. I just finished my first mainstream fiction novel, which is going out to market this week, and we'll see what happens with that. I'm writing a pilot for USA Network, working on a play. I'm also working with Axel Alonso and Bill Himas. We just launched a new comic book company called Artists, Writers, and Artisans to help them sort of create the structure for this new universe, this new company they're putting together. I'm writing, on average, about between 20 and 40 pages a day. That's my current rigors. And I love it. When I get away from the keyboard, I get nervous. I start twitching because I just feel like I'm not where I'm supposed to be. You could probably call it OCD or something. I have to be at the keyboard at all times. Poster child for Asperger's. But certainly I love it. To me, it's not a burden. It's what I do best and enjoy. So if I were an actual normal human being, it probably would be rather onerous. But in fact, it's the best part of my day. And so what I do is I get up. I work until like 4 or 5 o'clock in the morning most nights. Sleep for 8 hours. Get up, try and find my face, and I always find it. And sadly, it's always the same face, every time face. Then I make meetings and phone calls and revise the work from the day before. And then about 8 o'clock, the engine turns on in my head, and I just fly until 4 in the morning.
Well, it sounds like, I mean, there's a great deal of conditioning there. Like an athlete that's trained themselves to like wake up and be ready for game time at certain times of the day or whatever. Like, you know, you've uncorked that section of your mind that holds story and so that it's free flowing. I find it sometimes not terribly useful when people want to ask about like, oh, how does, you know, your writing method work? You know, do you put on your special robe or wear your like whatever thing in your room's just right, you know, as far as porting habits from one person to another. But for the writers who are listening to this, what things do you think from your own routines could be transferred to other people as far as helping them with that work ethic and with that consistency?
I think having the same place to write in every day makes a huge difference. There's a thing called state-related learning, where if you study a subject in classroom A, and then they give you a test, and half of the class is tested in classroom A, the other half is tested in classroom B, the students who are tested in classroom A will always do better because they're surrounded by the environment in which they learned it. And I think writing is much the same, where you write in the same place every day, you begin to create a sense of this is my writing space, this is where it happens. Do little things to keep yourself from closing off. So for instance, one trick I urge writers to do at the end of the day when they're done is whatever sentence you're working on, don't finish it. Leave it halfway done. Because the next day, often priming the pump is the hardest part and overcoming that inertia. When you stop that sentence halfway through, you knew what the second half of it was. So then you finish the sentence and now you're primed to go on to the next one. It gets you over the inertia of that. And just do it every day. Let it become as much a habit as breathing. And I think over time, the more muscular you become about it, the more you look at it as your job, the better you will get at it, and it'll become something more of a habit. There's this notion that if you do what you love, it's a hobby. If you do what you hate, it's your job. So if you are enjoying it, you don't take it seriously. You must take the writing seriously. Growing up, Harlan Ellison was a huge inspiration to me and made me understand that writing is a holy chore. It is something that you do to create something of lasting value. And when you realize that the work you are doing, however primitive it may be at the offset, is important, that writing is a holy chore, that this is your job, this is your profession, it causes you to have a different attitude toward your work.
There's nothing that lasts like story does. The great stories transcend civilizations and go beyond, edifices and, things can shake and fall down, but a good story can last beyond that. And while granted, we're at a time period where there's more story being created every day than probably ever before, just because there's a different kind of demand for those things out there. Having that thing that hits somebody and matters to them, even on a small amount, like you said, that's a holy chore to create something that takes somebody, somewhere else. Or like in your case, how finding Superman and finding comic books gave you a way to transcend the troubles that you're in. A story exists like that for everybody every day. So yeah, I mean, I think that's a powerful way of looking at it.
And I think you're right also too about how the stories allow us to survive. For me as a kid, loving Superman, I always try to imagine I would grow up to be him someday. And I joined the Superman of America fan club, and it was at a time when I was always getting beat up by bullies because I was always a new kid in town. And when you're the new kid, you don't have a posse, you have no one to back you up. And I would wear the Superman button inside my jacket. And so when they would start beating the crap out of me, I would just pretend I was invulnerable, that I was Superman, and they couldn't hurt me. And that helped me to get through the worst of that.
There's a value to having a secret identity, the reinforcing thing. Your career, you've gone from journalism, and you worked in radio and in animation and television and comics and movies and beyond that. And in this current media climate, it's far more common for people to write across a lot of different media because, you've got video games and comic books and apps and dozens of different opportunities, but that was pretty rare back in the day. How did you manage those transitions? Like, how did you make that flow from one thing to another? And now in the current day, are you still writing across a lot of different media, or are you starting to focus more?
In some ways, it was a conscious decision. In other ways, it was happenstance that led me into different genres in different forms, because I started off as a reporter and then blew up my career one day and walked away from that. Worked in animation and blew up my career one day and walked from that. And a lot of burned bridges behind me. Well, over time, I learned that the important part, I think, for any writer right now is to work in as many different areas as you can for two reasons. One, creatively, one feeds the next. It's like crop rotation, or in my case, crap rotation. So writing a good article teaches you structure, which you can use in a short story. It teaches you how to write dialogue, which you can use in the script for like a 1 hour episode, which teaches you a larger structure you can use in a movie. Everything feeds into everything else. Particularly coming from a journalism background, you learn discipline and to get it turned out quickly. The other part, too, is the three-legged stool theory when it comes to working as an artist or a writer of any kind, which is that you should always have three sources of revenue at any given moment. So for me, it's been at times comics, short stories, animation, or live action, movies, because at some point or other, one of those will get knocked out from under you. And when that happens, you can lean back on the other two legs of the stool until you get a replacement. If you only have one source of revenue as a writer, at some point you're going to get very badly screwed. And so I maintained that attitude until the present day. So I'm always working in, as I mentioned, television, working on the novel I just finished up, mainstream for the first time in a very, very long time. Comics, it just makes sense to me. It's a logical thing to do, and to stay fresh as a writer. When I came to LA, there were about a dozen writers that I knew who were kind of the big guys of that period, working in either animation or live action television. And over the years, they all fell by the boards. And to right now, I don't think there's any of them who are really writing at all. Maybe they may be doing one or two small things here and there, but they've all crashed and burned. And the reason for that is that they defined themselves to death. They said, this is the kind of writer that I am. This is the kind of story that I tell, which is fine as long as the market and the readers are there for that. When that stops, you're in trouble. And they built themselves a box. They lived in that box. And they died in that box because that's what boxes are for. So the more you can stay diverse as a writer, the fresher you will stay and the longer your career will go on. The average career for a TV writer in this town is like 10 years, and that's it. And I've been going for a lot longer than that because I refuse to settle down to any one particular mode. You keep changing, you keep growing, and your career will follow.
What do you find is the most challenging medium for you to write for? Is there any particular one that gives you a little bit more difficulty than others?
Most recently, I would say that mainstream novel that I just mentioned, because number one, I'm used to working in genre. If you get when you're to a point where you're not sure what happens, the monster comes in. Something blows up. And you really can't do that in most mainstream novels, particularly in a dramatic novel. And it was a very controversial subject, and I did it in an epistolary format, meaning most novels are written in, straight ahead narrative. Epistolary means you're writing in letters and journals and telegrams, whatever else. So it's really hard to sustain that. But that was the whole reason for doing it, because I wanted to challenge myself to do something I hadn't done before, something that had a huge chance of failure. So we'll see next week or two if I pulled it off or not.
The people listening to this won't be able to see this, but like in your office there behind you, there's a big Babylon 5 poster. And I think one of the notable things about Babylon 5 was that it was, I think in interviews, you'd sometimes refer to it as like a serialized novel for television, in the sense that it had an ongoing narrative, it had strong continuity, it wasn't, monster of the week kinds of stuff. And every action that happened, every consequence stayed and stuck with the show through its run. And that was really, really rare for the time when it came out. In this day and age, we see a lot more of that now. I mean, that really has come into vogue in a much bigger way. And I personally am a huge fan of that. But we have seen a few times recently where we've got programs that are doing that sort of long form storytelling and then are kind of falling apart at the end, whether in the eyes of critics or in the eyes of fans. I mean, clearly in this particular moment we're recording it, we're right before the last episode of Game of Thrones, and there's been kind of a big backlash to the episodes of this final season. You have shows like Lost that started off so incredibly strong and then seemed to kind of lose their way over time as they were kind of stretched out. And I don't mean to bag on any particular one show or anything about it, but clearly it's a trouble sometimes maintaining momentum and consistency as you go along. I'm wondering what your feelings are about that kind of like long-term storytelling and how you keep it on track, and especially how do you course correct when you feel things going off the rails?
There are a number of factors that work in what you're describing. One is very often the writers don't really plan it through or think it through. Before the 5-year arc became a thing, I knew writers who would go in and sell a pilot for a network series, write it, then it got picked up to series, and they would call me and say, "Oh my God, I don't know where to go now. I just have the pilot. Can you help me out?" and so they don't really think through all the ramifications. And I'm a very detail-oriented guy. I had like a bucket of snakes. When I was living in a commune in a cult back when I was in college, when they said we're going to recarpet the youth center, and we all went dumpster diving for scraps of carpet. And we came back. We spent the whole couple of days putting it all together, and everyone else had these big swaths of carpet. I had all the little tiny pieces. I'm putting them this way and that way and this way and that way. And when we're done, the youth minister comes out and looks at everything and says, "Well, I can tell what part Joe worked on." A lot of tiny little pieces. And you need to have that level of attention to detail to make this work. And I'm not sure a lot of writers understand what's really involved in that. I had a meeting at a network not long ago where I was talking about doing a show with a 5-year arc. And the executive said, "We have guys who come in here all the time saying, I want to do a 5-year arc, and they can never pull it off. What makes you think you can do it?" So I invented the mofo. But the other part of it, too, is very often the networks don't understand the level of preparation involved. So even if the writer does bring that preparation, the networks don't understand it. I know Damon, I know Ron from Battlestar, and they both sort of looked at the 5-year structure we did in Babylon 5 and wanted to take it to the next level, which I thought was terrific. And Ron sent me the pilot for Battlestar. And in talking to Damon, he said that they really wanted to do our structure, but what happened was that the network wanted to extend it beyond where they wanted to go. And when that happens, all the hard crafted work you put together to tell that story goes out the window. In our case, we were very lucky, in a sense, that Warner's ignored us. It was like benign neglect. So I think if they understood us better what we were doing, they would have gotten more involved, but they had no idea what the hell we were trying to pull off because no one had ever done it before. And they said, "We don't understand what you're doing. Go on, have a good time. Let us know when you're done." So I was able to do the story with a lot of creative freedom that otherwise I wouldn't have had. And in terms of changes that take place that you have no control over, that's just a matter of, again, preparing for every eventuality. And when I started the show, I had 3x5 cards for every single episode for 5 years, all worked out ahead of time. And I also had to see the trap doors so that if an actor had to leave or if there was a problem or something had to cause the story to shift, I could combine storylines, move that to here, drop that part, bring it back through the back door so that I could always have some way of proceeding with the story that I wanted to tell, no matter what would happen. Short of a zombie apocalypse, I was covered.
I like that you mentioned the trapdoor thing, because this is a thing I think about a lot, where when you write a story, like somebody writes their first novel or they write a pilot in a vacuum, you don't know what people are going to latch onto. You might think you know, like the character that will most get them. But particularly when something comes to the screen, if you get a charismatic actor, or you get chemistry between certain people, or you have a certain thing that just sings when it comes to the screen, you may find pretty quickly that what people want from the show is different from where you wanted to go with it. And particularly with people who are writing series, whether it's for TV or they're writing, a novel trilogy or whatever, and they're moving on with it. I'm really curious about like how you handle that as a writer, as a producer, as a showrunner, keeping hold of where you want to go, knowing that giving the audience what they want isn't necessarily always what you need to do, but how do you adjust as you learn something works better?
I think the thing is the audience doesn't really know what they want until they see it. And you're right, a character may take off, but that doesn't change the overall structure. I mean, you could be writing a story about World War II and or a series about World War II, and there's 8 characters and one you didn't expect to pops. That's not going to change what happened at the Battle of the Bulge. It's not going to change the bombing of Berlin. So you have to keep the bass notes going, the larger backbeat going, but be free enough to bring in the occasional melody you hadn't expected and work it into the structure to benefit you and to actually not undermine that structure, but actually to enhance it. So when Mira Furlan came in to us to play Delenn, having come from the former Yugoslavia, she brought with her that attitude of angst and grief from seeing her nation torn apart. And I pulled that emotion into the show and allowed her to, through Delenn, express those feelings that made her character more alive, made the arc feel stronger and more personal, and people really resonated with that. So I always look to the actors to say, what can I borrow, what can I use from their personal backgrounds to enhance that character's arc without undermining the show as a whole. Occasionally use it for evil purposes. There was an actor, Jerry Doyle, on the show who played Garibaldi, and once at lunch he mentioned he had claustrophobia. So from that day on, whenever I had a chance to put him in a small confined space, yeah, I took every opportunity because the terror in his face was real.
That is sadistic, but makes for good drama. Yeah.
And several angry lunch conversations.
Ooh, yeah. Something that I've particularly noticed like right now in some of the reactions to like Game of Thrones and stuff is that with long-term storytelling, particularly when it goes years and years and picks up a really big viewership or readership, is that people get really obsessed with dangling plot lines and foreshadowing and character arcs. People want things, neatly tied up in a bow. And when they're not getting it, like say in the season of Game of Thrones, where a lot of things aren't paying off the way people kind of expected them to, you end up with a lot of upset fans. I mean, as readers or watchers and not as critics, I mean, what should we keep in mind about long-term stories and how characters evolve and thinking about that idea of like satisfying plot lines and whether a character goes in an organic direction versus a very like tightly plot driven one?
I think it's less a matter of audiences not getting the resolution they want as it is not getting a resolution they can accept or one that is well done. I think that if you provide story logic to what you're doing, tie it in emotionally to what you're doing, the audience will accept it. If the character acts contrary to what they've done in the past X number of years, if the resolution is not properly thought through, if it doesn't make any sense, then yeah, you got a problem on your hands. But the notion that the audience isn't getting what it wants, to me, doesn't hold much weight because they don't know what they want until they see it. And either it feels emotionally true to them or feels emotionally false to them. And if you, as a writer, have ignored all the emotional history of the character and to get some big result, you change them 180 for the shock value or for authorial convenience where we can see the hand of the writer showing in the process, then you've got a problem. Then you have earned the ire of the audience. The audience will stick with you as long as you are being honest as a storyteller. And it comes down to the honesty of the emotions.
How do you check for that? I mean, like, I mean, you've worked with writing staffs and stuff. I mean, I know, like, I think the last season of Babylon 5, you wrote the entire thing except for, like, one episode that Neil Gaiman wrote. But in general, like, how do you look for that honesty? How do you recognize it in your own work? I mean, I know we have editors and stuff for that in fiction, but still, like, kind of recognizing that moment where you were doing what's story correct versus, like you said, showing the hand of the creator.
It really comes down to trusting your characters. Here's the secret. You want to be a writer, here's the secret. Imagine your best friend for a second walking across the living room at night and they bang their shin on the coffee table. Now you know your friend. You know exactly what your friend's going to say when that happens. You don't have to think about it. You don't worry about it. It's not homework. You just know intuitively the honesty of that. Writing is absolutely no different. You get to know the character so well that whatever you drop them into, all you have to do is write down what they do in response. And so for me, writing is not so much writing in a traditional sense as transcribing. I just look in the window and see what the characters are doing, and they can surprise you in the most goddamned ways. In Babylon 5, there was a part where we have an emperor named Cartagia who has to be brought down, and the whole season leads up to Londo killing this guy at some point. And as we got to that scene, I'm ready to write Londo pulling the trigger, as it were. And there's a character named Veer who was this quiet, mousy, non-threatening, bureaucratic, bumbling, scared little guy. He sort of stopped the action in my head and said, no, he shouldn't do this. If I do it, I'll have emotion and grief you can play off of it for episodes. If he does it, it's business as usual. And I thought about it for a second. I said, you're right, which is a weird thing to say to the part of my brain that was pretending to be him at that moment. And that became what it was. It comes out to really just creating the character so well that you know what they're going to do, listen to what they have to say, and trust them to lead you the right way. That kept me so many times from taking the wrong road on the show, keeping the show emotionally true to itself.
I like that. And I really like that description of if you know what your friends would do or say, if you know these people sufficiently well enough that you've got a good idea. I mean, people don't always act quote unquote in character, but we do, when we have a good sense of who people are, we're rarely that surprised I mean, like, I know I have friends that make the same poor choices over and over again. And at the end of the day, none of us are truly surprised, but we do have that hope that it would go a different direction. But you see that there's a certain inevitability to it, and I think that's frustrating at times as a person, but
I think you're right on the inevitability. And one of the band members of the Eagles was giving an interview not long ago. He said, here's the amazing thing about life and about storytelling. So when you're in your 20s and thereabouts, things are happening all around you. There's chaos. Life is throwing things at you. You don't know what the hell is going on. You have nowhere to stand. Everything's in flux. It's when you get older, like in your 50s or 60s, you look back and all this chaos reads like a finely honed novel. And characters are the same thing, where it looks like chaos and madness and craziness, but the more you stick with the emotional truth line, eventually a narrative begins to emerge from that, like a finely crafted novel.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, I think when we do go back and view the events of our past, like they make a lot more sense in retrospect. And I mean, I guess what they always, talk about with hindsight is true, but yeah, I hadn't thought about it that way, that there's like the through lines, the plot appears more clearly when you see it after the fact. That's very true. Really quickly, I want to talk to you about world building. You've built some very significant and fairly like complex, science fiction worlds. What is your methodology for world building? Like, how do you keep track of all that stuff? Like, like you've said, like, Babylon 5, you were putting up a board with, with the note cards and stuff, but we're keeping track of like the universe as a whole. How do you do that?
I think probably the most important element to world building is asking the next logical question and answering it truthfully, not conveniently, but truthfully. So if you're creating, the Narn homeworld, okay, what is it like? What's their culture level like? What's their technology level like? And what's their environment like? So if it's a very, dry environment, what does that lead to for wardrobe? What does it lead to for skin texture? What does it lead to for how they live? Do they live underground? Do they live on top? Every logical question being answered leads you to the next one and begins filling out that world. It's when writers start to say, well, I see where that's a logical answer. I need to go this way instead because it's more convenient for me. I don't want to spend the money for the wardrobe. I don't want to have to deal with the technology. And down the road, they find themselves in a very bad place because when you find yourself 30 miles off course, being 30 miles off course wasn't the problem. The problem was the turn you made way back here. So for me, it's just simply asking the next logical, scientific, grounded question. And again, because of the brain like a bucket of snakes scenario I mentioned, I really keep it kind of all in my head. The stories I had to put on cards because I need to see how they all would lay out with each other. In terms of the world building, I pretty much kept it all in my head, which is a ropey answer, but that's the truth of it.
I think there's a lot of people who function that way, and a lot of other ones that are probably like shrinking into their chairs right now, like, oh my God, I don't even know how I would do that. Is there any point where you've had the world building actually cause you to have an issue? Like essentially, like if you've developed out too much of a thing where I feel like a lot of science fiction introduces big ideas or big MacGuffins that end up causing problems for their narratives after the fact, because once something exists in the world, technically should always exist in the world to some degree or another. And a lot of narratives will just hand wave those things away or kind of forget that enormous solution exists. Have you ever run into that with your own writing? And if you have, like, how did you work with it?
I didn't, because again, I try to avoid convenient writing. And when you come up with some big thing that solves a problem over here that causes you a problem 6 months later, probably because you didn't think it through well enough and your solution to the problem was to roll in a grenade and come in firing rather than actually ask the next logical question. So I really haven't had that come up as an issue much for me at all.
Well, you must be very fortunate, because everybody else I talk to runs into that issue a lot, which, it shows that, like, you've got that kind of planning, like that, that, again, looking at it in that way, right? I mean, I think we see a lot of times in movies, and sometimes it's in series, because one director or writer doesn't jump from one film to the next or something. You'll have a moment where, like, oh, the thing that saves the day at the end of the second film, then the writer who comes onto the third film is like, oh crap, like that exists and nobody should ever die again or whatever, because like this thing changed. And, but I think when you've got more control over it, obviously you should be able to stop that.
Yeah, that's exactly the point. I think having written 92 out of 110 episodes of the show, I was able to avoid that very complex where often you bring in other writers who they want to do their one thing, make it big, their episode will have a big impact rather than thinking about how this services the entire long storyline. So the best example of this, I was interviewed Kurt Siodmak, one of the writers who worked on the early Universal monster movies like Frankenstein and Wolfman and Dracula, and he was big gregarious Eastern European guy, and he would talk about how it was very important among the writers of those movies to rat fuck each other. He said, I would end my movie with Frankenstein in the tower and the fire and the flood and the debris, and it washed away. Go fix that. Go ahead, make a movie out of that. He would end his movie in a way that would screw up the next writer. So whether you do intentionally or not, you have multiple writers, sort of each wanting to be the guy who did this really cool big thing. Then you have people pulling at the structure and the tapestry of the storyline rather than working as one key honed unit. And by virtue of the fact that I wrote, like almost 90% of the show, helped me to avoid a lot of that.
Comics, especially like mainstream superhero comics, has that problem a lot where, if you definitively kill a character now, 6 months, a couple of years later, somebody else who just comes in is like, okay, I'll take this job, but only if you let me bring back so-and-so. And then, we resurrect somebody again. And even, some of those stories, those resurrection stories are some of my favorites, but at the same time, there does seem to be this constant like tug of war of when a person comes in, they're like, okay, but yeah, what I want to do is this. So we've got to, retroactively change the background so that we can handle this again.
Humans want to leave a mark, and writers are, for the most part, human. And so it's really important to them to say, I will leave my impression here, and I will rat fuck over the next person, and I don't care.
Well, that's pretty dog-eat-dog for the writer world, but it seems on par with what it means to be a human. So yeah, I can see that. Really quickly, like, what is your like outlining process? These days, you said you've done the card thing and stuff before, but for like, say, your novel, or even with the memoir or whatever, like, how do you handle outlining?
I suck at outlines. If I can avoid writing an outline, I will do so. Here's my flaw as a writer. If I'm writing an outline, I'm not in the moment with the character. I'm just trying to guess what this character might do at any given moment of time. Versus when I try to guess, I'm almost always wrong. When I'm writing a script with the character in that moment, reacting with them, seeing not what I think they might do, but what they actually are doing, I'm almost always right. So the cards, for instance, were just like 2 or 3 lines of here's what the story's going to be. And I'm so inept at outlines. It's not even remotely funny. Sometimes what I will do if I get hired to write an episode of television or pilot is I'll write the script for myself, get it right, then write the outline based on the script and turn that in and wait for their responses and adjust the script accordingly. I did a thing for Spielberg that way not long ago where he wanted a movie written. He said, can you give me an outline? I said, oh, you're not going to want to read this because you will think you've hired the wrong guy. So he let me away with not doing an outline.
That's very interesting. I do get that idea that like that sometimes with just the flow things that you're making character decisions, not plot decisions.
Yeah.
And I think that harkens back to some of the things we were talking about earlier, where sometimes when you're making plot decisions ahead of what makes sense and as honest decisions for your characters, you can definitely run into problems. So I think that makes sense together.
So the German philosopher once said that the difference in Germans and Americans was that Americans built their personalities from the outside in, and Germans built theirs from the inside out, which of course he would say. And there's this plot and character. You either build from the plot into the character or build from the inside into the character out to the plot. I think that if you start with the character and you know who the character is, where they're going to go, what they want, how far they'll go to get there, and how far someone else will go to stop them, when you have those questions answered, you have your plot, you have your story.
That's solid. I like that. That's very cool. What are your tools of the trade? What kind of software? Like, you say you're at the keyboard all the time, but do you do pen and paper stuff outside of those note cards? Like what other stuff do you do to get it down, or to like maybe even like break out of if you have an issue with a problem somewhere, do you do anything different?
I write at the keyboard because I can type a lot faster than I can handwrite. Often my handwritten notes are indecipherable even to me after a day or so. And I can type 120 words a minute, so I can plow through a lot of material very quickly. I save pen and pencil for editing and for revising because my process is that I start off in a script saying everything that I can say about a subject, then I sand it down to everything I want to say about a subject, and send it down again to everything I need to say about that subject. By the time I get to that point, it's like glass. You slide right down the page. The software is just, the typical scriptwriter software, like Movie Magic 2000 and word. Most of my best work gets done when I'm trying to go to sleep at night. So I'll have if I'm working on a piece of a script or whatever, I hit a natural break point, I'll load up the questions in my head. And usually by the next morning, I'll have an answer to it. But often what happens, I'll finish up for the day, I'll go to bed, lie down. And just as I'm closing my eyes, the evil part of my brain says, I have an answer. Great. Okay, I get up, turn the light on, get the notepad, write it down, put it down, go back to bed. 5 minutes later, the other problem you were having, I worked it out. Swell. Where were you 3 hours ago? And this will go on sometimes for hours until finally it's like, are we done now? Can I go to bed now? Okay.
I think that's the thing that non-writers don't realize about writers is that when you're really into the craft, that you're always writing because your brain's always, I often call it like a background process, like you'd have on your computer or something. You've got like, something that may not be what's in the foreground, but it's still going in the background. And when you kick back over to it, it's like, oh, I figured out something. It's got to be one of the best feelings when you have those moments where something got figured out without necessarily like you having to deliberate on it. A lot of mini eureka moments where the characters have figured things out for themselves or a problem is fixed.
Yeah, and you only hope that in the morning when you look at your notes from the night before when you're trying to get to sleep, that it just doesn't just say like, the room smells funny. Like, what the hell was that?
You hope, definitely. And then as we wrap up here, in between all of that writing that you're doing and all the stuff that you've got coming out, what are you putting into your brain right now? What kind of stories, TV, books, film, anything? Like what's feeding the writer brain?
I don't have a lot of time to watch much television, but I must say I love Doom Patrol. I think it's an astonishing piece of work. I love Billions, oddly enough. And I'm a secret, my guilty pleasure is Project Runway, which I recommend to all my writer friends, both of them, that they should check out. They always say, why would I want to watch Project Runway? I said, all the things that writers do in their heads that screw them up, you can see on Project Runway made manifest in textiles and fabrics and zippers. The inability to listen to criticism, the inability to edit, not collaborating well with others, not working with the client. And that thing that happens in any artist's career where you're just about to get where you need to go and that part of your brain that self-sabotages, explodes, and blows everything up. And you want to see the creative process made manifest, you watch Project Runway. So that's, oddly enough, a favorite guilty pleasure of mine.
I think a lot of those shows that whether it's, it's something I watched I think the first 5 or 6 seasons of Project Runway, but a lot of like the baking and cooking shows and stuff too, where you see a craft that, is creativity and science kind of at the same time. But you see how often people like they run into big problems and you discover their make on how they handle that. If they turn it to their advantage or they manage to take a bad situation and make it work, or if they crumble under it. I think it's a really illustrative thing to see how people react under pressure.
And the thing that I also would point out to anyone out there who was also thinking of becoming a writer or an artist or anyone in the creative arts, the one thing I hear constantly from people is they say, I'm going to give it like 3 years. And if I don't make it by then, I'll give up. And here's the horrific part of that decision. Writing is no different from any other art or craft. If you go into wood shop tomorrow for the first time, you're not going to make the Sistine Chapel. You might make a napkin holder, but it's going to be uneven. And by the time you put 3 years in doing it, you're just getting to the point where you're good at it. And that's where most people stop because they're afraid, because their families won't support them, because they think they're not getting there. And if you believe that your role is to be an artist or a writer or to say something of substance to the world, it's not a 3-year commitment. It's not a 2-year commitment. It's not something you do in your spare time. It is a lifelong commitment where you assign yourself into service in a monastery made out of words. And if you look at it as a lifetime commitment, suddenly the amount of work becomes more understandable and comprehensible, and the goal becomes more easily perceived. So for those out there who are saying, I'll give it 2 years or 3 years and then I'll give up, don't. Keep going, keep fighting, keep working at it.
It's a marathon, not a race.
Yes, always.
So where should people be following you so they know when the next works are coming from you? Like, what's your Twitter and other places that people can keep up with what you have going on?
My Twitter account is my last name, just @Straczynski. The bio comes out on July 23rd. I'm going to be doing a crap load of conventions and bookstore appearances around the country to go with the publication of the book. The new comic book company, AWA, debuts, I believe, in the fall with the first 2 issues there. main source to follow my nonsense would be the Twitter account.
Well, awesome. Like you said, Becoming Superman comes out from Harper Voyager on July 23rd. It's a great read. It's enlightening. It's difficult, but it is a real look into the creative mind and ways to overcome some really horrific things. So I think it's an important story for creatives and writers to read, along with people who just enjoy good nonfiction narrative. And what it literally amounts to being a lifelong fan of your work. This has been a real pleasure. I've really enjoyed talking to you, and thank you for joining me on Fictitious.
Thanks for having me.
This was the first episode of Season 4 of Fictitious. You can find all the episodes from Seasons 1 through 4 at the all-new, completely redesigned fictitiouspodcast.com. The site has some cool new features that I hope you enjoy. Fictitious is available to listen and subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Google Play, and Spotify. It's now also available on Stitcher, TuneIn, Player FM, and Pocket Casts. For updates, news, and general book and author-related shenanigans, follow the show on Twitter or Instagram, where I post as @FictitiousPod. You can also chat about nerdy things with me at my handle, @AdrianBusky. Did you enjoy this episode? Let me know. Let other people know. Share Fictitious on social media, tell your friends, or use your words and write us a review on your podcast service of choice. You'll help support the authors who share their stories and writing knowledge here, and you'll help me to grow the show. Every tweet, share, and review helps, and they're all very appreciated. Next week, Jade City author Fonda Lee joins the show to talk about her latest novel, Jade War. You won't want to miss it. I'm Adrian Busky. Thanks for listening to Fictitious.